Hello, everybody. This is Hyana Park from Spy Palm Partners. I'm kicking things off today on behalf of Matt Hardy, Program Director for Policy and Planning at AASHTO. Welcome to Webinar 37 in our Transportation Asset Management webinar series, sponsored by Federal Highways and AASHTO. Today, we'll be taking a look at communications and coordination related to transportation asset management and transportation asset management plans. This is a bi-monthly webinar series. That means we host a webinar every 2 months. And we've hosted webinars in this series going back to 2012 on a variety of topics in asset management. In our last webinar, we got an early look at an FHWA-sponsored research project reviewing the initial TAMP submissions. It was an informative session. I encourage you to look it up in the AASHTO TAM portal. There you'll find more information on this webinar series. So just go to tam-portal.com and click TAM events in the main menu. You can also register for upcoming webinars as they are announced. And you'll also find archives of previous webinars. Links to video and slides from today's webinar will also be posted on this site. If you have any suggestions for future webinar topics or have questions to the presenters today during the webinar, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's Q&A feature. We'll answer all the questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. We're looking forward to your questions, so please type them away as you're listening to the presentation. And now I'll turn it over to Steve Gay of Federal Highways for a welcome and introduction on behalf of our co-sponsor, Federal Highways. Steve.
Thank you, Yana. FHWA, in cooperation with AASHTO, is very pleased to sponsor this valuable webinar series. We've now reached our 37th webinar today, and we're looking forward to many more to come. This series provides a unique opportunity to share practical, useful, timely information with the asset management community. Today we're looking at communicating the TAMP in the role of strong communication in stakeholder engagement. Now think about the whole issue of communicating. What's the TAMP telling you? In looking at all states are working on their final TAMP, close to having it completed in the next couple of months. When it's done, how will it be used? What will you be communicating? As you do your documentation to demonstrate implementation, and you go back and check what happened, you look at those investment strategies. What's happening? I think you're really going to also see that real crosswalk and interrelationship of asset management with, I'll say, PM2. How does it all fit together, and what message can you communicate with the TAMP? And especially as you're working with stakeholders. Stakeholders may be other owners, stakeholders may be state legislature. A lot of things to think about that I'm sure this webinar speaker today will bring their perspective on some of these topics. We will hear about some important challenges as well as successful practices. We all know TAM is a multidisciplinary practice that depends on strong communication and coordination. And just as TAMP development brings an even wider range of stakeholders to the table, a strong TAMP development process requires effective internal and external communication. I think you're going to enjoy today's presentations, and I hope you all learn a lot. I'm certainly looking forward to that. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Yana.
Thanks, Steve. Now, as Steve mentioned previously, the purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are building working knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to communicating asset management, beginning to apply this knowledge in the context of TAMP communications and coordination in order to answer the following questions. What approaches are agencies taking to help communicate the TAMP? What benefits can my agency expect by strengthening TAMP communications? What are key lessons learned for agencies as they move forward with internal and external TAMP communications and coordination efforts? And of course, to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge. For the agenda today, Matt Hobrick of Iowa DOT will deliver our first presentation. In our second presentation, we'll hear from Shannon Foss of Minnesota DOT. Michael Johnson of California DOT, or Caltrans, will deliver our third presentation. And our final presentation will be from Nate Higgins of Cambridge Systematics. And we will have Q&A at the end. So just another reminder, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar Q&A feature of the menu bar you see on your screen at any time during today's presentation. And yes, we will have the slides and the video made available after today's webinar at tam-portal.com. So now let's get started with our first speaker. Matt Hobrick is the Transportation Asset Management Administrator at Iowa DOT. Matt currently serves as the chair of the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management and is a member of the TRB Asset Management Committee. I will say he's a newly minted chair of the AASHTO Subcommittee. Congratulations, Matt. He has been involved in numerous national conference planning committees and NCHRP panels. Matt's career experience is primarily in the field of data analytics. He's been with Iowa DOT since 2010. Matt.
Thanks very much, Yana, and looking forward to being part of this panel. I want to start out today just kind of talking a little bit about a key stakeholder that we have that we're working on addressing, and that is our Transportation Commission. And I'll give you a little bit of background to start out, sort of why we're focusing on that particular group. So I'm going to explain a little bit about our highway investment process. So a few things to know about how Iowa DOT projects are programmed. First, you kind of start looking at the revenue picture, and I'll kind of caveat this by saying I apologize if I have any of my folks from program management who are watching this. They're probably going to be grinding their teeth about my simplified explanation of this process, but I'm going to try to give it at a very high level view so that we can have a little bit better understanding of why we're focusing on the commission as a core group. But we have revenue that's constitutionally protected. We have kind of a mix of federal and state funds. About a third of our overall funding is coming from the federal side, and the rest is from state fuel taxes and also vehicle registration fees and vehicle purchase fees. Those funds are distributed between the DOT and local agencies by formula. The DOT portion, or most of it, is called the Primary Road Fund. And each year, the legislature appropriates a sizable chunk of that Primary Road Fund to the DOT for our operations. That includes like salaries, equipment, maintenance, things like winter operations. We buy a lot of salt with those funds. What's left over is available for programming, and that money is allocated to projects through what we call the 5-year program. So every year, we put together this 5-year program that talks about all the projects that we're going to have over that 5-year stretch, and even get some forward visibility beyond the 5 years to larger projects that we might be looking to get started. And that program is approved or selected in coordination with our Transportation Commission. They're a 7-member citizen commission appointed by the governor, and they're among their many duties, 2 major documents that they need to approve include our statewide long-range plan and our annual 5-year program. And so their role in helping us to set those long-range vision and also to determine the projects that we're actually going to program makes them a key stakeholder when it comes to asset management. something else to be aware of is, like many DOTs, as our workforce has shrunk, and we've shrunk by 40% since 1996, we're less able to do things with our in-house forces. Most of the things that kind of are considered maintenance, at least things that impact our pavement and bridge life, is really done by contract now. And most of those contracts are paid for out of the 5-year program. So when we think about our 5-year sort of capital program, it's not just sort of new construction projects, but it encompasses all kinds of rehabilitation activities and even maintenance kinds of activities like crack sealing and patching and that sort of thing are largely, not entirely, but largely paid for through the 5-year program side. So to be successful in implementing asset management, we really need to be able to connect with the 5-year program. And this means engaging with our commission and helping them understand how our system is performing and what their role is in helping to maintain that system. So as our asset management initiatives were kind of restarting in the last 10 years or so here, we started to engage the commission. And in the 2013 to 2015 timeframe, we did a number of presentations with the commission. By the way, they meet on a monthly basis, and they have a workshop in coordination with their business meeting. And at that workshop is typically where a lot of this type of information would be presented. And what we were doing is going to them kind of on an almost annual basis and just kind of talking to them about what is asset management. At the time, we were using a software tool called Prezi. Some of you may have seen. This is kind of like the main slide from the 2013 Prezi that we did, where we sort of talked to them about some of the investment strategies we had, what we were looking at for performance measures, where we were with developing our asset management plan. This was shortly after MAP 21 was out, and so we were all trying to figure out sort of what those requirements were going to look like. I think even prior to the rulemaking coming out from the preliminary rule. And then also some of the things that we were looking at engaging with local agencies. Here's another concept from some of the things that we were talking about with them in 2015. This is when we went in front of them, talked to them a little bit about where we are with our TAMP, how we were looking at integrating things with the long-range plan, where we were with risk management. We were at the time working on a gap analysis project that was funded through Federal Highway. Thank you for that, because that was very useful for us in looking at developing our implementation strategy and just other updates, kind of keeping them up to speed on what was happening. So you can see this is very similar, but again, at this point in time, we were pretty much just talking to them, maybe not even once a year, but just giving them sort of broad information about asset management. And as we then moved into 2016, and we really had kind of gotten beyond that initial phase, we had a presentation in February 2016 where we really started to lay out some of the implications of asset management a little bit more concretely, I would say. We went deeper. We talked about our system and where we were going with system condition. We talked with them about things like cost inflation. So we started to lay out things like in the upper right-hand corner, you see we were talking about the ideas of doing preventative maintenance and how that could be potentially a cost savings versus kind of letting things deteriorate and getting into major rehabilitation, giving them kind of simplified examples. We talked about things like if we underfund our bridge maintenance, what that leads to in terms of an accumulated kind of loss in valuation for bridges, or even looking at the impact of things like the construction cost inflation in terms of the loss of buying power in our pavement program. So we started getting into quite a lot more detail. We also gave them some very simplified kind of explanations of things. So this is just a kind of a simple example where we said, okay, well, here's how many total square feet of bridge deck we have, 37 million. And you want to say an average cost to replace a square foot of bridge deck is about $300. So if you kind of multiply those numbers out, you get a total replacement cost of all of our bridges of $11.1 billion. And then you say, okay, well, how long do we expect the bridge to last? If we expect it to last 50 years, then that is kind of going to that lower left line where we would say that we would need to be investing something like $220 million a year just on a straight line kind of depreciation basis to maintain our stock of bridges, or that's how much value they would sort of be losing every year. Is another way to think about it. If you say a bridge lasts 75 years, we're looking at $148 million a year. Or if we say that they're going to last 100 years, it's $111 million a year. No matter how you slice it, these numbers all turned out to be more than what we had been investing in our bridge stock, and it kind of helped to the commission to understand that this isn't just some complicated models that are a black box that are kicking things out. There's really kind of some simplified thought experiments that we can provide that can help to paint the picture of really what some of the issues might be and what the need is for us to look at how we're investing in this stock of infrastructure and what its needs are over the long run. Starting in 2017, we kind of changed focus a little bit. We had a governance implementation group that had started up, and they is coming out of our first asset management plan. We really worked hard on our governance and getting some pieces in place to make asset management something that we all do within the agency. And so we started focusing on this programming process in the implementation team. We identified that we really had some key times when we needed to be presenting information to the commission and getting their feedback so it could be incorporated into the program development process. We also had some early victories that I'll talk about too, which included things like some of that information that was presented earlier helped to be a winning argument to double the investment that we were making in our bridges. And we also saw some significant increases in our pavement investments for pavement rehabilitation. And this was, as much really due to sharing this information internally with management and others as it was sharing it with the commission and sort of forcing us to simplify our arguments and help to shine light on areas where maybe we had not everyone had really realized where we were chronically underinvesting. So a couple years ago in the 2018 to 2022 program, so this would have been kind of in the 2017 timeframe, since the fiscal year starts kind of in the middle of the calendar year. We had just a single presentation that we did at that March workshop, and it's right in the busiest month of the program development, where we talked about pavement and bridge needs. And we kind of came away from that realizing that probably wasn't quite enough, that we really needed to try to do a little bit more and a little bit earlier in the program development cycle. So then for last year, for the 2019 to 2023 program, we did a series of 4 presentations where we started out in November, kind of giving an overview of asset management. Then in 2017, we went a little deeper on bridge stewardship. January, we talked in depth about pavement stewardship. And then in February, we came back and talked more about the system perspective for stewardship and looking overall at the system. And I think that really set a good framework for the commission to have a good understanding of kind of what some of the issues were, and I think it was influential into some of the decisions that were made in that programming cycle that we're currently in, or for the currently active program, I should say, because right now we're in the process where we are drafting a program to be sharing with the commission, and that's for the current cycle, the 2022 to 2024 program. And for this year, we've had a TAM presentation scheduled every month. We've worked to lay out a schedule of topics. We coordinated that schedule with some of the key programming events, and we've put information about asset management in front of them much more frequently. And we've also been listening to their feedback and adjusting what we've been presenting, but trying to do a more of a coordinated presentation to help them understand what the data and information are showing, and then also to run some scenarios that are reflecting some of the priorities that they're expressing to us. I'm going to give a few examples of some of the things that we've showed them. So this is one from a pavement presentation. I just grabbed one slide here to share that is showing kind of what we call our 150% funding scenario. So the dark gray bars that you're seeing here would represent the non-interstate stewardship budget that we have for pavement preservation rehabilitation projects. And then the light gray kind of represents a scenario where we're adding maybe an additional 50%. to that. And then the orange line is showing what would happen to the forecast PCI were we to have that additional investment above and beyond the baseline. And so then they're able to see kind of what that buys in terms of pavement condition, and also kind of where that is relative to the target value that we set based on our state's pavement condition index that we use as kind of our optimization index. Another quick example, likewise with pavement, here we've done various pavement scenarios, including looking at reduced funding at 75% of current. The green line is 100%, 125%, all the way up to 200%. So they can see how much funding might be needed for them to invest in order to get to our target value, or they can understand the implications of various funding levels that might be set versus the baseline funding that has been shown in the prior year's program. So this is kind of the information that allows them to really understand those scenarios, and this is coming right out of our pavement management system. Then as we kind of rolled into looking at the entire program, we ran some of these same scenarios, or presented some of these same scenarios, but now in one page, we're showing them not only the pavement information, but also the bridge information, and we're breaking it down into the non-interstate and the interstate. Those are kind of two major funding categories that we have within the program. So even though in our TAMP we talk about things according to the NHS and the interstate, we don't separate the funding for the NHS. I think most states are like us in not separating the NHS out in terms of separate funding category. And so as we talk to the commission, we put it in the context of what they're used to seeing, which is really talking about the non-interstate kind of in whole, rather than breaking out the NHS. We also are showing them how these scenarios add up in terms of total funding, and then in the chart at the bottom of this page, we showed them the variance from the target at these different funding scenario levels, so that they can, at a glance, kind of see what the impact would be of various funding scenarios in terms of both pavement and bridge condition on both the 5-year time horizon and then the 10-year time horizon that we look at as we're programming. We also talk to them about things like cost comparisons. So when we say, if we say we could have an additional $30 million available to us, that could, for example, buy 4 miles of new expressway, or it could buy 15 miles of 2-lane pavement reconstruction, or 60 miles of pavement resurfacing, or up to 15 bridge replacements. So it gives them a sense of kind of the trade-offs that they're making as they're making the programming decisions relative to capital and stewardship projects. We also give them some important takeaways, like things that are coming at them if we don't have continued investment, that we're going to see some deterioration in our pavements and bridges. And we also make recommendations about where we would like to recommend that they'll get increased funding. So just kind of looking forward a little bit, I will say that as we've been communicating with the commission, that feedback has largely been very positive. We have also seen management being very supportive of this monthly cadence of putting information into the monthly workshops. Those workshop agendas tend to be pretty packed, and it's been exciting to see management saying, we're going to make room for these kind of presentations because this information is of value, and the commission is actually asking for it as well. So we're continuing to work on that monthly calendar and tying it to the program development cycle, and working on developing presentations that we'll be making in the future. And then, as I kind of indicated, we're going to keep refining. We are getting some great feedback. We recognize that this communication is not just us talking to them, but them talking to us and all of the other stakeholders that are also engaged, and recognizing this is a two-way street, and continuing to try to figure out ways to refine the story that we're telling to help it resonate better. That's all I had to share today, but I'm happy to answer any questions either now or at the Q&A part later. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matt. We'll wait to do the Q&A at the end. So if people have questions for Matt, please type them into the Q&A bar, and we'll take them in the order they come in. So, so for our next presentation, we'll hear from Shannon Foss. Shannon is the Asset Management Planning Director at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. She's the project manager for MnDOT's statewide Transportation Asset Management Plan, which contains 12 asset classes. And she's terrified of the expected foot of snow currently just starting in Minnesota. So we want to report as we go through the webinar of where you are in the accumulation process. All right, take it away, Shannon.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I'm in a conference room with no windows, which is probably a good thing, so I don't keep track of how much is accumulating out there. Thanks, everyone, for choosing to spend your time here today to learn about TAMP communications. I'm Shannon Foss, and I titled my presentation OOFTA, Communicating MnDOT's TAMP, because OOFTA is a term us Minnesotans use when, for example, there's snow coming in April that we're not thrilled about, and also things that are big undertakings, and that TAMP communication is one of those things. Now I'm going to focus on more generic communication around the TAMP, and I've divvied that up by internal communications and external communications, because it involves a little bit of different communication based on internal versus external. Now, a reminder of a background of where we are at MnDOT. We were one of 3 pilot states to create an asset management plan that was completed in 2014. So we have been working on the communication piece for many years now. Everyone is familiar with this timeline of our final TAMP due in June of this year. Now I wanted to highlight the teams involved here, and that communication piece, as Matt just ended his presentation with, it really is a two-way street. So not only are we trying to share some of the decision making in regards to asset management, but the big key is learning from others in the agency. I'll start at the bottom of this visual. We have asset expert work groups, and that's really more the technical staff. So we give them the framework of creating a TAMP, and they provide us with all the information we need throughout the planning process. So they're really the technical experts that provide all the components of the TAMP. Now, up one level is our TAMP project management team, and that's really our planning staff, as well as some coordination with our Federal Highway Administration Division office, but that's more the day-to-day activities throughout the development process. Now we decided there was a need for a TAMP advisory group, which is a higher level group. You can see it includes office directors, program managers, and FHWA. And since we have 12 assets in our TAMP, a lot of that work is done at the asset level with those work groups. Now, the purpose of this TAMP advisory group is to have a more overarching view and make sure we have consistency between those assets and more focus on the cross-asset trade-offs there. Now, finally, at the top, we have an Asset Management Steering Committee, and this is an ongoing committee at the agency that provides direction for all asset management activities, not specific to the TAMP advisory group. Again, that's a higher level group with division directors and, again, FHWA. And together, all of these teams serve very important roles, and there's times where we have them all come together for workshops. There's times where we utilize them individually throughout the process as needed too. This is showing the audience that we are reaching out to in regards to our approval of our final TAMP. Now, it's important to us to make sure that leadership at all levels is familiar with what we're really submitting to FHWA. Of course, we're required to have commissioner approval, so we wanted to make sure we checked our boxes throughout things like our senior leadership team, our planning management group, and executive leadership team. Now, these folks, this won't be the first time they see our TAMP, but it's keeping them up to speed on substantial changes between earlier versions of our TAMP and our final submission. Now, I really want to focus on a workshop we held. This is really good timing because we actually did it last week. And the purpose of this workshop is we are familiar with the workshop offered by FHWA that really digs into how to do life cycle planning and a risk analysis and the financial planning. And we considered hosting one of those workshops at our state, but we thought, well, let's make a workshop that is more tailored to our needs here. So we actually hired Katie Zimmerman, who I saw is on the line today, so I get to share how great she was throughout the process. She helped us host a TAMP implementation workshop, and it was a 2-day workshop. We invited about 120 folks at the agency that we considered key decision makers that are really going to be the ones to implement our TAMP. And it was a few different pieces of the workshop, one being the training component. We have a TAMP, what's in there? Katie put together a big workbook that really pulled out the key pieces of our TAMP that the attendees could follow along with. But more importantly, we held facilitated discussions with attendees to really get their feedback on, okay, what are some things at the agency that would hinder our implementation of the TAMP? And now we've prioritized those, and those will be used to create sort of a work plan of what we should be focusing on for TAMP implementation. So thank you again, Katie, for a successful workshop. Now, I wanted to highlight a few other internal TAMP implementation pieces. I'm the project manager for the TAMP, and I exist in our long-range planning group. So there's a lot of good coordination with our other plans. We also have a asset management program office where they focus a lot more on the technical side, but we have really good coordination where anytime other folks are presenting to various stakeholder groups internally, they include TAMP in their presentations. So it's always on the forefront of people's minds throughout the process. Our group serves on several technical advisory panels for other asset management related projects. So we have that TAMP point of view in other projects at the agency. And then I think a few other agencies are familiar with the gap analysis that was sponsored by FHWA. So that really discussed asset management gaps specific to MnDOT. And there was a wide communication of those results and how to implement them. And several of those actually were incorporated into our TAMP as well. We have an asset management policy here at the agency, and that's also presented to many functional groups throughout the agency. And this really communicates the importance of the TAMP and how it fits in with other agency objectives. So we say that the TAMP drives the need for policy, and the policy really supports the TAMP. And I pulled some language out of the policy, and this is a commitment that we are making at the agency where MnDOT will make investment decisions and conduct asset-related work as necessary to fill the commitments made in the TAMP. Now, I'll focus on external communication. So MnDOT owns about 14,000 total roadway miles, and local agencies own only about 78 roadway miles of the national highway system, or about 1%. So I know a lot of other states have a lot bigger complexities in in regards to working with other owners of the NHS. However, in Minnesota, we collect and maintain all of the data for that 1%. So, of course, it was important to communicate with them what the TAMP is, that help them understand their data is in there, but it didn't require a lot of complex coordination with them. So we reached out to all county and city commissioners that are owners of the NHS and sat down with them and their staff to communicate exactly what is in the TAMP. Additionally, even though MPOs do not own any of the NHS, we have kept them up to date, presenting at MPO committees and presenting to the directors. And then additionally, we have some statewide projects that are related to asset management planning that I serve as a TAP member for. So, for example, we're currently developing an asset management guide for local agencies in Minnesota. Now there's a global organization called the Institute of Asset Management, and we recently started a Minnesota chapter of that. And I serve on the steering committee there, but it's really a place for local agencies, state agencies, and consultants to get together and share best practices of asset management and really learn from each other. Of course, there have been several presentations both in Minnesota and nationally on our TAMP. So I'm really glad to see that there are organized webinars and conferences and committees throughout the U.S. where people have a good working relationship with their counterparts in other agencies to really learn from each other throughout the TAMP development. Now, in the future, we hope to develop a more formal communications plan, and we have a chapter in our TAMP that is titled Implementation and Future Developments. So that's really serves as a work plan to facilitate that communications piece, who should be involved in that, share lessons learned, share what commitments are being made in the TAMP to ensure that they are being implemented. We do have a dedicated asset management program office, as I mentioned, so that will be very sustainable in those future implementations. And then I thought it was kind of fun that we found we have over 300 presentations between our asset management group talking about the TAMP. So clearly we reach out to a lot of different audiences on a regular basis. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to Hannah.
Thanks, Shannon. For our third presentation today, we'll hear from Mike Johnson. Mike is the State Asset Management Engineer at Caltrans. In this role, Mike led the development of the California TAMP, and he's going to speak to us today about Caltrans's TAM and TAM stakeholder outreach. Now I'll turn it over to Mike.
Good morning, and thank you. Well, at least it's morning still in California. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the aspects of our TAMP outreach in California. In order to really appreciate the need for the outreach, it's important to understand kind of the configuration in California. We have 18 metropolitan planning organizations that we need to coordinate with. We have 26 regional transportation agencies, and then we have some really large cities and counties. In some cases, some of these large cities and counties may have infrastructure that, exceeds some small states. We also have to coordinate with our tribal leaders, transit operators, advocacy groups. We have established a Transportation Asset Management Advisory Committee, and then Caltrans has our regions, divisions, as well as our Transportation Commission. So lots of players in this mix, and the map kind of shows the breakdown of these different organizations. But for the purposes of this presentation, when I talk about stakeholder outreach, I'm primarily going to be talking about the metropolitan planning organizations, the regional transportation planning agencies, and in some cases, larger cities and counties. The remaining items on the remaining groups on this list, were all invited to all of these and in most cases participated. But our primary focus was really getting at these NHS owners. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing here. Okay, here we go. So our approach was to conduct a series of workshops in the process of building the asset management plan. These workshops were developed into 6 basic categories. What is the asset management plan? Sort of an introduction and requirements. This was really our initial, this is what we're up against, folks, type of workshop. Then we had a workshop in inventory and condition, one on risk management, one on financial plans and investment strategies, improvement plans, and then our final one was on target setting. And I will say that these workshops are a lot of work logistically to put them on. We engage SPI-PON partners to help put the workshop material together and to help with the logistics of these workshops. And that really gave us a shot in the arm for our relatively small asset management staff. In our first workshop, we really provided an overview, and this was all about getting everybody on board with what we have to do. In California, we're a little bit unique in that we have both federal and state asset management requirements, meaning federal law or federal regulation and state law. The challenge is that these are not the same scope of inventory. State law is the entire state highway system. We've got different asset classes than we have at the federal level, and the potential for different performance measures and other differences. So these dueling requirements really added to the complexity and also our stakeholder confusion about, when they hear talk about the asset management plan in a commission meeting, it means the state highway system and not the local NHS. And when we talk about it in a federal context, we're now talking about local agency assets. We introduced the expanded NHS, and this was important because most of the agencies initially, what's the NHS? They don't think about the NHS. They don't manage by the NHS. And then we got the very common question, well, what about the rest of the local transportation system? Why are we only worried about this small portion? In California, the NHS represents about 6% of the total local system. So to them, this is sort of a minority of what they have to manage. We discussed many alternatives to acquiring condition, and similar to Shannon, mainly there was a lot of pavement concerns. The federal metrics for pavement are very different than what the local agencies use in California. They're primarily using pavement condition index. In the end, Caltrans agreed to collect all of the NHS pavement in the state. Why did we agree to do that? There's just too many agencies, too little NHS. Some of these agencies have, a mile or two or a bridge or 4 or 5 bridges. It doesn't really make sense to try to manage them responding to us and hoping they get it right and chasing down that we get it. So we're just doing it all. It is worth mentioning that Caltrans was already doing all the local bridge inspections for the most part. So we didn't have the issue of collection for the bridges, but for pavements, we did. So coming out of this workshop, the big things then, what's the NHS and why do we care? Just a recognition that this isn't the bulk of their system. Pavement metrics were a subject of a lot of discussion because many of the MPOs in California use software that's based on pavement condition index, and they have existing pavement management systems, and moving to good, fair, poor was a problem. There wasn't a good feeling. I mean, there's no history or minimal history now with good, fair, poor conditions. So, going into target setting, this was a real challenge. And then, confusion over the allowance of the pavement serviceability rating for pavement and what that means. And, a lot of the MPOs were looking for an avenue to continue to use PCI. In terms of the pavement inventory, we used this graphic. Total lane miles about 402,000. About 49,000 of those are owned by or managed by Caltrans. 352,000 are managed by local agencies. If we look specifically at the NHS, about 74% of the NHS, 74% of the lane miles managed by Caltrans are NHS, and about 6% of the lane miles managed by the locals are NHS. So you can see if you look at the bottom right column and the bottom left column, these are the lane miles that get excluded from the TAMP, and this was a big concern. For bridges, it's a little, similar graphic. The difference here is that Caltrans is responsible for about 90% of the NHS bridge deck area, and locals have about 10. Compared to pavement, it's more like 65% Caltrans managed, 35% local managed. The locals' impact on the pavement is substantially more than it is on the bridges. Our second workshop focused on, this is our third workshop, risk management, focused on risk. And, a couple things. We did a workshop format. It was small tables, 8 or 10 people per table. We mixed up the participants, meaning the local agency attendees, the MPO attendees, federal highways, Caltrans, advocacy groups. We mixed everybody up and we assigned them seats. And that was a really good thing because it helped bring a lot of diverse perspectives to this discussion. And then rather than have each table deal with each topic, we gave them all different risk topic. And we had categorized these, and then each table spent a decent amount of time developing risks in that topic area and then presented to the larger group, and then the larger group could add input. So the outcomes form the basis for our TAMP risk management or risk register, in addition to things that we're doing with respect to risk assessment or vulnerability assessments. We then held a workshop on financial plan and investment strategy, and this was a challenge. What financial resources are available for asset management? That's the question. It's relatively easy for Caltrans to answer what funding we have available for the state highway system, but the NHS is only a fraction of that. And on the local side, they can tell you how much they're spending to preserve or enhance the system, but the NHS is only 6% of that total expenditure. Neither Caltrans nor local agencies are tracking expenditure based on whether it's an NHS route or not. So determining what resources are available is very difficult, particularly with the funding structure in California. Half of the counties in California have their own transportation tax that they impose and they collect locally. Additionally, a significant amount of improvement dollars are allocated directly to cities and counties. They don't flow through Caltrans. So getting at the resources available was quite a challenge. We did develop some investment scenarios, and these, had to be based on proportions of NHS to total system relative to the budgets that were available. The feedback from this workshop was that, if we're doing a scenario analysis on 6% of the system, it doesn't mean that much because we've excluded so much of the system. So that was somewhat of a challenge coming out of these workshops. And then we did an improvement plan workshop. Our TAMP took an approach of basically what is the state of the practice today? Where do we want to be in the future? And then what is it going to take to get us from the current state of the practice to where we want to be? And so the improvement plan was really, how do we get to where we want to be? And, we got a lot of feedback in the workshops, and that feedback fed into this improvement ideas and priorities that's in our TAMP. And then our final workshop was on target setting. This is where we tried to bring a lot of this all together. And, we solicited expected 2- and 4-year targets from all NHS owners. Even though the federal requirement was 4 years, there was for us, we wanted to know, well, what's this intermediate point for the stakeholders as well, the MPOs, RTPAs, and so forth. And so we asked them for 2- and 4-year targets. We did all of our scenario planning on 10-year outputs, and then we used these targets of what the NHS owners expected, and we developed a quantity-weighted statewide target, which is included in our TAMP. And so this graphic here kind of lays out how we did it, and I've kind of hidden all the agencies here, but basically, for Caltrans has about 9,200 NHS bridges, about 210 million square feet. And then you could see all these various agencies, how many bridges they had. Some have, 2, 3, 5. Others have several hundred. And you could see they're all in various different conditions. And so we looked at, each agency setting their own progress for improvement from their starting point. And then we weighted it by their quantity, in this case, deck area for bridges, to come up with our total statewide target. So our statewide target is 4.8% for the NHS. State-owned assets are already better than that, but some of our partners are not. And so when you sort of weight all this together, this is how we arrived at our number to include in the TAMP and for our target setting. On the far right column of this, it's kind of interesting to look at the percent impact that each agency has on the statewide total. So for bridges, I mentioned that state has about 90% impact. All local agencies combined have about 10%, but many of them, like Agency 1, their percent impact is in the hundreds of a percent. And clearly there are certain agencies like Agency 13 that are really driving the bulk of that local number, or Agency 6. So this was a really effective way for us to show, we provided this information, we showed this in the workshop so that the agencies understood how it was that we were developing this statewide target. But underneath the hood of this statewide target is, in fact, 17 agencies' individual targets. And that approach was pretty good for us because it allowed us to recognize the different starting places of each of these agencies, the size of their inventory, and their ability to affect a change in their condition. When we published this as the state's targets, all agencies in California adopted the state target, I think in large part because of this process and the fact that it's actually supporting 17 different agency underlying goals. So in summary, Caltrans solicited stakeholder input really at every step of the TAMP development process. Our draft TAMP was published for public comment. We held hearings at our Transportation Commission, and ultimately the Commission adopted the Asset Management Plan prior to the submittal to FHWA. And that was important because under California law, it's the Transportation Commission that has the final approval authority of the state's asset management plan. And the NHS, the final approval is the Federal Highway Administration. So I've kind of got two masters or two oversight groups that I'm trying to satisfy both in one asset management plan. We talked a lot about the target setting. If there's, if anybody's interested, all of these materials are publicly available on the website shown. And you can see the PowerPoints that were presented. You can see the summary of the feedback from all of these workshops, the attendees of the workshops, and so forth. So with that, that's kind of a quick overview of how, what the stakeholder outreach was for the development of the California TAMP.
Thanks, Mike. Before we move on to our final presentation, I just want to remind all of the participants to use the Q&A part of the menu bar you have on the GoToWebinar app, and you can start just typing in your questions for the panelists. All right, so for our final presentation today, we'll hear from Nate Higgins. Nate is a principal at Cambridge Systematics with more than 13 years of experience in performance and asset management. Recently, in addition to leading NCHRP 2024 Task 124, which he'll be discussing today, Nate helps states around New England implement data-driven decision-making processes. And now I'll turn it over to Nate.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the NCHRP project, which was a peer exchange called the Performance Management Reporting Peer Exchange. And I want to talk just a little bit about, what we did and what the issues were and what we took away from the peer exchange process. So, first, this broadly was named for performance management in general, but quickly we realized that we really ought to focus on pavement performance measures as part of the PM2 process, because as Mike was just talking about, some of the issues between state and federal pavement performance measures were much more challenging to talk about than some of the others, for bridge and safety. And also, I'll just say that the audience that we were thinking about here were sort of the general population, the media, the legislature, kind of most people who might come along asking a DOT or federal highways about the difference between a federal and state performance measure. All right, so the event, we invited intentionally a blend of communications, performance management, and pavement management experts from diverse states and also federal highway, so that we could get a blending of these perspectives and have people sort of stepping outside of perhaps their comfort zone and learning something from their peers across the aisle. So here's a list of the folks who attended. I know some of whom are on the line today as well. So it was a really good, energetic group of people, and I think that I know that I learned a lot from everybody. So as I mentioned before, the challenge that we posed to the group and that we were faced with was developing a communication strategy to help explain the difference between your state pavement performance measure and the federal pavement performance measure. When we were doing our initial background research for this project, one of the best examples that we saw came out of South Carolina, and just a simple showing of stacked bar charts of the good, fair, and poor of the DOT measure compared to the federal highways PM2 measure. And what we realized is that, perspectives really matter. So if you are a state who talks about a target or has been talking for decades about a pavement performance target in terms of percent good, then for most states, the federal highway measure tended to make your performance appear worse than it used to. However, if your state looks at percent good or fair as a combined sort of grouping, then the federal measure can make yours appear to improve. And third, if you as a state measure, percent poor, then the federal highway measure tends to make your performance appear better. So this sort of perspective is one of the kind of key components of things that we learned. And we learned a lot about sort of the differences and the guts of why these things are different. But, just understanding that these two measures are different and that they tend to go in certain directions and sort of unpacking how you talk about them was kind of a critical first step in explaining, how these two things are different. So from the workshop, what we did is we worked through a number of interactive processes so that we could get folks to sort of sketch their ideas and everything else. And what we came away with was this notion that really the states and the federal government are both after the same thing. So they have a shared goal and everybody wants sort of the same data. So even though the measures are different and can make the pavement condition look different from state to state and between states and the feds, that there's a critical component that everybody's after the same thing. And so thinking first about the power in data, a state measures roadways and bridges to assess progress. Most have been collecting pavement condition data for years and decades. It's sort of built into the common narrative of how you talk to your legislature and how you talk to your committees and how you talk to your newspapers and the general public. And also, not for nothing that it's how you have been making your investment decisions for all of these years. And so it's sort of ingrained into the culture of a DOT, the way that you talk about your measure. But then on the federal side, they were tasked after MAP 21 and the FAST Act to develop a common set of measures so that they could understand the health of the national transportation system. And to do that, because every state has a different pavement condition measure, they had to come up with a way to talk about them all in the same way. So even though they're different, they had to sort of group these into a single measure. Understanding that states also need flexibility because they have different weather, geographies, traffic patterns, maintenance plans, and all of these things affect pavement conditions in different ways. And also they have to make their own funding decisions. States, you all have your own revenue sources that you have to program in your own ways. And then on the federal side, though, it's required to seek a complete picture of the condition of the national system, and has to collect the data the same way for every state to do that, while allowing for state flexibility. The shared goals between the federal government and the states, though, are that everybody wants to work to deliver an efficient, effective, and safe transportation system. Some of these really simple words about how everybody's after the same thing, we really felt like were a powerful way to communicate, it's okay that these things are different. There's a reason why they're different, but we're all after the same thing. Other messages here, use tax dollars in a wise and effective way to deliver a better system. And also just generally that better data will lead to better decisions, investments, and improved system performance. So a couple of, building on that, a couple of takeaways that as we were crafting our messaging for this was it's best to keep it simple. We know that there's sort of the curse of knowledge, and that, we can know a lot about pavement performance and talk a lot about cracking percent or rutting or, the difference between longitudinal cracking and, and other kinds of cracking. But really, the people who are going to call and ask about the difference between, you know, federal and state pavement performance are not pavement professionals. So keeping it simple and can help to keep, you know, above the weeds. But then also it can help to limit conflict. So by not introducing some of the details and the specifics about, you know, why these things are different or how frustrating it might be when they are different, just talk about the shared goals and keep it simple. Teamwork is important, you know, that the state and then the federal agencies are working together so that we as a team can deliver what the public expects. And framing this as a common sense thing, of course, the federal pavement measure needed to be different than the states. The states have their own, they're unique, and they need to be flexible, and they have their own reasons. But keep the focus on the taxpayers, that these are the people who are giving us their hard-earned money and their hard-won dollars, and keep them out of talking about the nuance of policy so that they can sort of understand the message and understand the reason for the different measures. So, you know, again, keep it deceptively simple, just keep it to the points and high level because the public, they're not the experts and they don't need to be. But that said, we know that there can be some follow-up questions. So, you know, when people do jump in and need to get a handle on some of the details, then as through our survey and through our background research and through the peer exchange itself, we did collect a lot of really good examples of how states have built visuals to try and communicate the differences. So I'll just sort of walk through some of them here. This isn't the whole package, but once the document is from the peer exchange is out, you'll have a full sort of record of all the sketches and everything that came out of it. One from Mike Johnson from California. Here is the, you know, he sort of showed a different version of this, but this is sort of that there are different, from the state perspective, there are different assets and different systems. He spoke extensively about this, but this was a summary just to show how the Venn diagram of this overlaps in some places, but not everywhere. Massachusetts had, they wanted to show specifically the comparison of their state pavement performance measure, which is called PSI, and the federal measure. Both in terms of the distresses, which show up in rows here, and also in the categories of that they included another one for PSI called excellent. So they wanted to show a couple different dimensions of how their measure was different than the federal measure. Rhode Island had a sampling approach to visualize the difference between the federal and the state measure. What you see in the x-axis here is PHSI, which is the state pavement performance measure. And then in the y-axis is sort of a percentile distribution, so sort of a histogram. But the way to read it is that the green line here represents good in the federal highway measure. And then you can see how for something that shows up in good for the federal highway measure, looking at PHSI, it ranges from somewhere around 83 all the way up to 100. And if you do the same sampling for the fair condition by the federal measure, PHSI ranges from 37-ish all the way up to about 99. Similarly for poor, it ranges from 30 up to about 87. The point that they were making here is that, you know, you can see that there's, trying to compare one to the other, there's a distribution here of what you might expect, and it's not a direct relationship. And in fact, there's overlap between and among the different federal measures and the state measure. Michigan has more of a geographic comparison take, where the lines that you see on the map in red are where the state measure is poor, but the federal measure is fair or good. So there's large sections of road in the state where you know, the state measure shows that it's poor, but it shows up as better condition in the federal measure. Minnesota had an example here where they showed the sort of the trend over time up on top of the actual Minnesota measure, and then on the bottom of the actual federal measure. And you can see how the trends over time are similar, but the slopes are a little bit different, and they don't always move in the same, there's sort of a dip there in 2015 in the state measure, and you don't see the same dip in the federal measure. So again, there's similarities, but they're a little bit different. And this is the original South Carolina example that we used to show our perspective difference at the lead-in. So with that, I'll just close my presentation. I think those are some examples when folks do come to you and want some details about why these things are different. As I said, there are more that get into details of measuring crack percentage in wheel path and how that can affect the pavement measure and all those types of things. But I saved those for the final report.
Thanks, Nate. One question that did come in was when the report for the peer exchange was going to be available.
Yeah, it should be available in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Nate. All right, so that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you to all our attendees. Now it's time for the Q&A. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature of the webinar toolbar, and I'll take them in the order you've asked for it. So, so this first question is from Karen Miller. Were there any common communication messages for state DOTs to consider, or was it just the general principles that were included? I'm guessing this is for Nate in terms of what were the findings of your study?
I think what we learned is that because there were so many commonalities and we were never going to get to the bottom of explaining away exactly why everything was different between the state and federal pavement performance measures specifically. And so when we started to sort of peel back the onion, so to speak, we really came to the conclusion that keeping it simple and keeping those sorts of topics at a very high level was probably all most people were going to need when it came to it, understanding those commonalities. And so we did put together a couple of from two perspectives. We put together sort of an explainer from the state perspective that had some specific words that could be used, and then also a similar kind of complement to that from the federal perspective with some specific words that could be used, and paragraphs highlighting the key points that somebody might want to make. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Nate. All right, our next question is from Brandon Verolik, and he's, I think, asking a general question of the state DOT panelists and asking how are states handling the change to the definition of structural deficiency. Many states have used this as a historic performance measure. Also, many use it as part of funding distribution or candidate selection. Nebraska is continuing to calculate structural deficiency status by previous methods to include bridges that had poor structural evaluation, item number 67, or poor waterway adequacy, and to maintain continuity with historical reporting practices. So, Mike, do you want to take this one on, since you are familiar with? Mm-hmm.
I knew you were going to pick on me for this one because it was a bridge question. In California, we've been trying for many years to get away from structural deficiency. We don't manage by structural deficiency. because there's many things that the structurally deficient categorization doesn't include that are very important in California, like a bridge's vulnerability to seismic events, for example. But there's other things that just flat out aren't included within that structural deficiency. So we've been downplaying it for a long time. That doesn't mean that media outlets don't continue to grab it. I think there's still various industry groups like the Trip Report and maybe others that, and for a long time, Better Roads were publishing things based on structural deficiency. But it's really, we don't like to report it. We don't think it's a very, it's a metric that will drive our decision making. But having said all of that, because we get all these media requests for it, we still have to keep our eye on it. As far as the change, in effect, a poor bridge is close to what a structurally deficient bridge was, with the exception of those two things that were noted: waterway adequacy and structural evaluation. Most of the bridges in California that were structurally deficient because of the deck condition. Very, very small numbers because of waterway adequacy or structural evaluation. So it hasn't been a big deal. We don't make a big deal about that metric, so we don't really have the same challenges that you might have in terms of, matching back to legacy trends. So probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but that's our situation in California.
Thanks, Mike. Just a clarification, that question came from Kent Miller from Nebraska DOT, not Brandon Verlick. So Matt and Shannon, do you have any response to Kent's question?
I'm not the expert from
okay.
the bridge side, but what I've understood from talking to our bridge folks is that essentially the structurally deficient is very similar to poor, or they've even described it as being basically the same. The poor definition being essentially the same. So at least from our perspective. So I think we've basically just kind of interchanged those two terms. To my understanding.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah,
Shannon?
I believe it's the same case at the Minnesota DOT too, as Matt mentioned.
Yeah. All right. So another question for everyone. So I think that many of you spoke about the communicating related to the initial TAMP, and you've gone through the experience of doing that. Are there things you're going to change in your communication for your complete TAMPs because you've learned and you have more, better insights now on how to do it? So for any of you, you want to start, Matt?
Yeah, I think, for us, the immediate answer is we're not sure yet. I think that, we're continuing to kind of refine and evolve our message over time. So I'm sure that as we kind of absorb the lessons learned through the analysis that we've done in preparing our final or our complete TAMP, whatever the right terminology is, to comply with federal requirements. Also be our third asset management plan. And the plan itself certainly is important, but a big part of our focus at Iowa DOT has really just been on our governance process and trying not only to focus on the TAMP, but also on how do we implement asset management within the organization. I know we're not alone in that, certainly, but I would say that as we're evolving, that it's not just the asset management plan that's influencing the evolution of our messaging, but it's also the feedback that we're receiving from other folks, and as we're engaging a wider swath of the agency, instead of just kind of maybe some core groups that have been involved in developing the plan in the past. So really it is a continuous evolution, and I think it always will be, as we're learning new things and as we're applying those lessons that we have learned, and helping to refine our communication and to also understand more about how the system is performing.
Thanks, Matt. Shannon?
Yeah, I think we've been focusing so far on the development of the TAMP and understanding what our gaps are in the agency. And now we're going to shift gears and focus more on that consistency determination piece. So really pulling out what commitments are we making in the TAMP and what are our steps to meet those commitments and make sure that the right folks are involved as the decision makers. The big thing that we've been talking about is we've been doing asset management for many years, but now it's kind of putting more framework to it, and that requires more of a cultural shift in that decision-making piece, especially since a lot of our decision-making is decentralized at the agency. It relies a lot in the hands of the districts. So now we're at the point where we want to focus on those greater Minnesota decision makers and really how are we going to essentially meet our commitments that we make in our TAMP.
Thanks, Shannon. Mike?
It's a great question. We've been working with Federal Highway Division Office here in California and other Federal Highway resources. We're looking at this, what we're calling the final TAMP. I'm not sure I agree with that term either, because we see this as sort of a living document, but we've got to do a major update a year from this summer. And so we're looking at this as kind of an interim, and that major update, just to clarify, is per state law requirements, not federal. But we're looking at this work that we're doing going into the summer here as sort of minor administrative changes. We had received some comments on our certified TAMP. They were, there were meaningful comments there, but most of them were narrative-based comments, not not analysis-based comments. The only real big addition or change, if you will, is adding our targets in. And we actually had the targets in our initial TAMP prior to the formal submittal of them, and they really haven't changed, but we're kind of strengthening that within the TAMP. But we're seeing this more as an administrative interim release rather than a full reworking of the TAMP that we submitted last year.
Thanks, Mike. I just wanted to comment from Kent Miller, who asked the structural deficient question. He said, FYI, Nebraska shares California's perspective on structural deficiency. We don't use it for bridge management on the state system, but local system uses it and funding mechanisms still rely on it. Dropping item 67 has a big effect on local network that has many bridges that load rate poorly. So thanks, Kent, for sharing that with us. I just have one final question for Nate, and that is, through the project you did, was there any one innovative way to communicate, meaning less the like the paper media or just the graphic media, but did you come across anything that really caught you as something kind of new and different in terms of the way to communicate asset performance?
Sure. Yeah, actually, so the exercises that we ran, we ended up with a lot of really interesting sort of results. The one that's probably a little bit different, but not a lot different, is, we sort of understood, we imagined this process where, the Reason Foundation or TRIP or some other industry folk might, publish a report, and then the reporters call up the DOT. DOT, has built a website that sort of has a complete kind of explainer, very, maybe 4 or 5 pages worth, but very succinct with interactive graphics and things like that could explain what pavement condition is in the state and how that looks at and how it's similar and different to what the federal measure requires. And then also kind of a complementary AASHTO or national sort of website that you could put out, that they would host, perhaps through the portal that could have that sort of complementary information to show the federal measure and all the states. And I know that, and there's a couple of those things already sort of in the works, but I thought that was an interesting solution. Probably the most fun one came out, and it was, I forget exactly who it came from, but it was an interactive game where there was this idea that folks really wanted to educate people about sort of the value of pavements and what pavement condition even was. So they sort of peeled back, the layer even that far to try and understand that. And I think certainly the website is more well within our grasp of building, especially through this effort. But then the game was sort of a nice sort of complementary piece that, gave everybody a bit of a smile anyway, and helped us, think through some of those kinds of solutions. So, yeah, it was good.
Nate, do you remember what state used the game approach?
I think so it was a particular group. We were broken into groups. Nobody had actually used it. It was an idea that came out of the workshop. So it wasn't a real thing yet. It was sort of a proposal, if you will. Yes.
Gotcha. Fun. All right. Well, thanks, Nate. Thanks to all of our panelists. Our next webinar on advanced technologies and TAM will be held in 2 short months on June 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have the presenters confirmed shortly. This is a topic that basically looks at kind of new technologies applied to asset management. So we're in the vetting process for who the presenters will be. So if you have a good idea, please let us know. I hope you'll all be able to join us at that webinar. Additional webinars will be continuing for quite a while. Please send ideas for new webinar topics. And and you can see here on the screen, the next set, we have the next 4 lined up. This was generated with the joint TRB AASHTO asset management committees at one of the meetings that they had. We had the topic and these were prioritized from that dialogue. So just a final reminder, for more information, you can visit tam-portal.com and get all of the webinars, today's webinar information, as well as the past ones. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all of our panelists. Big applause.